We can save questions for afterwards. I'm happy to answer whatever I can. So,
Anybody else?
my name is Sable, and I'm here at Triangle Square. I'm going to talk today about a wonderful and amazing pharaoh whose name, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, was Hatshepsut. And she was one of the very few female pharaohs of ancient Egypt, and she was a wonderful ruler, one of the best pharaohs they ever had. And we only discovered her in 1922 because her memory was erased for thousands of years, which I will talk about. So she was born in 1507 BC. She died in 1458 BC at the age of about 50. Her father was a pharaoh. She was the daughter, sister, and wife of a king. And her stepson was Thutmose III, and he was her co-ruler for she ruled for about 20 years, which was longer than any other female pharaoh in ancient Egypt. And she was one of the most successful pharaohs they ever had in Egypt. So when she became she ruled as the regent. Thutmose II died, and she was reigning from 1479. And when the king died, the actual new pharaoh was her stepson, Thutmose III, and he was named pharaoh, but he was only 2 years old. So she was regent. And in the 7th year of her regency, she declared herself pharaoh, which was very unusual. They very seldom did that, had a woman pharaoh. There were several other women pharaohs, but very, very few. So she became pharaoh, and she declared herself the king, not the queen. And she's pictured with the false beard that a lot of the pharaohs were pictured with. The men didn't actually even wear the false beard. It was just for the statuary and the statues. But she had an amazing number of accomplishments as a pharaoh. Egypt had been invaded prior to her reign, and they were kind of decimated, and their treasury was very low. And she reestablished trade networks all over the ancient world, in the Aegean, Western Asia. She had a very famous expedition to the land of Punt, P-U-N-T, which was a very wealthy little country. Now, nobody knows today where Punt actually was. They think it's northern Africa somewhere, but there was no maps drawn, and they hadn't traded there for a long time. But she has on her tomb pictures of the expedition. They brought back gold and ivory, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, myrrh and frankincense were very valuable. They were made incense out of them. They were almost like money. And she brought back live myrrh trees from Punt, which she put in her temple, which I will talk about later, and started to grow them in Egypt. And she made Egypt hugely wealthy. And with that wealth, she did an enormous amount of building. She built more buildings than any other pharaoh except for Ramses II. She had loads of buildings and a lot of statuary to go with it. So she may have even led a military campaign early in her career, but mostly her rule was completely peaceful. Egypt was very strong. They had a strong army. Her stepson, who grew up, but she wouldn't allow him to be pharaoh, he was in command of the army. So he kept Egypt from being invaded or run over by other people. And she also built her mortuary temple. She was the first big structure in the Valley of the Kings, which is very famous because after her, a lot of pharaohs put their temples and their mortuary temples in the Valley of the Kings, but she was the first one. And she did hundreds of building projects. And you may be interested to know, we always think that the ancient pharaohs used slaves to build their buildings, but they didn't. They did local people. They paid them, all the workers, the skilled and the unskilled workers, they all paid them. So she took all this money from trade, and she built hundreds of buildings, sphinxes and other obelisks, and she paid the people, so the people loved her. They were very grateful. They had a lot of work. And she did so much statuary that every major museum in the world that has ancient Egyptian artifacts in it has some of her statuary in it, every single one. And she did obelisks, which are just like spikes in front of a temple. They were the tallest in the ancient world. And there's one of them still standing as the tallest ancient obelisk that ever. We're still standing in Egypt even to this day. And also, and her mortuary temple told the story of all her accomplishments. That's what the pharaohs did. When they built a temple, they would do pictures on the inside of all their accomplishments, and it was like advertising for how famous and successful they were. Sometimes they even lied completely about things, spin like they do now, fake news, just like they do now. But she really did a lot of very good things. So it was a very long, peaceful, wealthy period for the country, and she was a patron of the arts and the building. And she was, and also, they also found a game board. Now, this is very much fun for those of you who like board games, which I know some of us do. They played an ancient board game called Senet, S-E-N-E-T, and they found this board game with carved lioness-headed red jasper, which is a mineral, board games inscribed with the pharaohic insignia, her insignia as a pharaoh, and they found a board game that was hers. And there was also, they actually, so her architect Senmut, and there's who was actually, he was a commoner, and he was her number one person underneath her. She trusted him. He supervised all the fabulous architecture, which was it was new at the time. He did a lot of innovations in architecture. The architecture he did was so spectacular that it wasn't rivaled for 1,000 years afterwards till ancient Greece. I mean, this is just like spectacular, classical, perfect architecture. And he rose and rose, and she even trusted him to educate her daughter. And there are statues with him holding her daughter, who was her only child. And there was also some speculation that they might have even been lovers. And there was graffiti in he made a temple for himself too, because she let him do it, because he was her favorite at court. And there was some graffiti there afterwards from the workers, ancient graffiti, like 1,500 years old, that Senmut was screwing Hatshepsut. They were lovers. It was the workers would do little hieroglyphics of pornographic graffiti, which is very funny. And anyway. So let's see. So it's very interesting how they discovered her mummy. Well, what happened was, so she had this long reign, and her Thutmose III, who was her stepson, was head of the army, but she never let him rule. And after she died, he, or his successor, took her name off all these hundreds of monuments, and he claimed them as his own. And all her accomplishments in trade and keeping the peace, he pretended it was him. And subsequent pharaohs used her monuments for their own. And so she actually, after she died, she disappeared from history until 1822. Now in 1822, they discovered the Rosetta Stone, which actually was a piece of ancient writing that had 4 or 5 different languages saying the same thing on it, one of which was ancient Egypt and other languages at the time. And what happened was, when they discovered this stone, archaeologists, they were able to learn to translate hieroglyphics, which they never could before. and they learned how to translate and read hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt from this very famous Rosetta Stone. And they discovered that there was a female pharaoh that they didn't even know about in this on the walls of her temple. And that's how they discovered Hatshepsut. What happened was he broke up Thutmose, her stepson, broke up all her statuary, but he left it in a pile of rubble. So they discovered this rubble later, thousands of years later, and they had pieces with her name on it and where they could trace what happened. And there's a lot of speculation as to whether her stepson, if he hated her because she kept him off the throne. She ruled for 20 years. He was plenty old enough to be pharaoh for most of that time. And she kept him from coming to power for 20 years till she died. So the speculation was that he hated her. So by the time she actually died, he was furious and he wanted to erase all memory of her. And he was a very accomplished general, and he took over Egypt after she died, and he went out and conquered a lot of land and did some things. But it's a very interesting, so we don't really know what happened, but it did happen. We don't know why. Also, it's an interesting story about her mummy. Her mortuary temple did not have her mummy in there. And they did find a box with a tooth in it with her name on it, just one tooth. And they did a CT scan on it and probably DNA. And then in 2007, Zaiwi Hawass, who's one of the foremost archaeologists in Egypt, and he was a curator of the antiquities in Egypt for many years. In 2007, he discovered a mummy which was buried near her tomb, and it looked like it was a match for the tooth in the box. So they did a DNA, and they discovered, so that he found her mummy. And they discovered that she'd had bad teeth, she'd had a tooth abscess, which is why they'd pulled the tooth. And also she had bone cancer. And they said that she would have inherited skin conditions because they were very inbred. As you know, the pharaohs were very inbred, and they had a lot of hereditary diseases because of that. And she probably had a very bad skin condition, which made her skin itchy. And she was using this, she didn't know it was poisonous cream to relieve the itching. It probably had arsenic or lead in it or something, and it's probably what gave her the bone cancer. And also she had abscessed teeth and diabetes, and she died about age 50. So, it's a wonderful story, and it's an amazing story of an amazing woman who was one of the greatest pharaohs Egypt ever had, and we didn't even know about her. And of course, he never would have erased her name if she'd been a man. He only did it because she was a woman. Just so you know, those are familiar with the lesbian Judy Chicago. She did a tremendous art exhibit, I think it was in the 70s, about women, and she gave Hatshepsut a place in her art exhibit. And also, there's a novel that I read 20 years ago, and it's called Child of the Morning. And I just remember for 20 years how much I enjoyed this book, which was a novelist's recreation of what her life might have been like, including her relationship with Senmut, whether they were lovers or not. And it's a wonderful book, and they may even have it in the library, and I'm going to try to get it out again because I'd like to reread it. So that's the story of Hatshepsut, and I'm going to stop now, and I'll take questions.